No one should be denied the opportunity to experience the benefits and joy that comes with the human-animal bond. And the way we can do that is by addressing those inequity and lacks of access to pet resources that we see that can sometimes either jeopardize or break those bonds. We want to make sure that there's increased community-based animal welfare programming in communities that have been historically either ignored in the past or have been historically underserved in the past. And in a larger scale, our goal and hope is to dismantle discriminatory policies and systems within not just animal welfare, but within our systems as a whole that harm both people and the pets that they love. Pets for Life has been around for about a decade now. This is our 10th year. Since then, we have served over 250,000 pets. We have helped with over 130,000 spay and neuter surgeries and provided resources and supplies to over 625,000 individuals throughout the United States. And just so you know, our programs we have, it's all throughout the United States. It's not just, and we do this model in all kinds of communities through urban areas, through rural areas. We even work on Native American reservations. We work with and we also have some in different territories as well, such as Puerto Rico. Since doing this work, I want to share some data that we have learned in this insight, which I think is to us very telling and very important before we get into this deeper work. When we first interact with clients that came to us, we noticed that the 88% of those pets that we met were unaltered. And 70% of them have not seen a veterinarian before we've reached out to them. In addition, 78% of them have never been contacted by animal services. And this data to us is startling because it tells us something, that there's this community that clearly loves their pets and they're engaged with them, but they have not had access to these resources that are so vital in making sure that our pets are provided with resources and care. And we know, especially working in animal welfare organizations, that we have a ton of resources. And so if there's people here who have not had this contact, we need to figure out why is that happening. And I think it's important to note that animal welfare over the past few decades is really good at what we do, which is trying to really put that animal to focus. We have seen a huge move towards spay and neuter movement, towards adoption, and we tend to make sure that we have that pet as a primary focus. But it's important to recognize that animal welfare needs to connect to larger systemic challenges for people and their pets if we really want to help everyone as a whole. And what we're not saying is to lose sight of the animal, and we think that's very important, but it's to actually get a clearer picture for that animal and to show the whole thing. Where's that animal's environment? Who is that animal with? What is their, with their person? And when we look at this entire connected, holistic viewpoint, not only can we do so much for our communities that we serve, but we can actually help more animals and pets and people stay together. So an important part to recognize of some of these challenges is really discrimination and oppression that happens within some of our underserved communities. And this is from a wide variety of ways. There's income inequality and wealth disparity. And here's a list of a few. We're going to talk about a few of these today. And I actually have some data from Canada, since the majority of our people here are there right now. This data is a little bit different than the United States. If you are interested in learning more about how this plays in the United States, please email me. I have a great leaflet that I can send you that breaks this down. But I want to just kind of go over how we can see this, how we can see some of this oppression and discrimination work in Canada and how it affects the people and pets that you serve. So 1 in 5 racialized families live in poverty in Canada, and this is compared to 1 in 20 of non-racialized families. This is important because poverty is usually linked to, again, lack of access to resources. When you have that huge discrepancy, it also limits the ability for individuals to be able to access care or vet care or any other resources they might need for their pets. Another way to just measure this as well in terms of looking at the disparity and in equity is through child poverty. This kind of focuses more on Toronto, but it's important to recognize that percentage of children age 0 to 17 that live below the low income measure after tax, and that's 26%. And that shows to show that there is a lot of poverty that's happening, especially in the larger cities. But that's important to recognize because there's a group of people who have limited access to resources that we can make sure that means that we're underserving. And so housing is a huge crisis. We're having a housing crisis globally at this point, and Canada is also not out of that. If you look at this chart, it kind of breaks up unaffordable housing by region. So if you see in the green, that's inadequate housing. That's not enough bedrooms for size or makeup of the household. The light blue is for the percentage of unsuitable housing, and the darker blue is unaffordable housing. And as you see throughout the major cities, there is a significant increase of unaffordable housing in Canada. And how this it plays in animal welfare is what's one of the reasons that we hear animals are surrendered. Well, especially at least in the U.S., it's housing. So many people have to give up their pets because they're unable to move into housing that accepts pets. And when you are unable, and as we know, unaffordable or affordable housing tends to have less options for you for pets. They either might have breed restrictions, size restrictions, or sometimes even just no like restrictions of pets as a whole. And being able to navigate that crisis sometimes means that people have to give up their pets or are unable to take them with them. Also, an important thing to recognize in animal welfare is that a lot of our organizations are sometimes connected to a enforcement piece, whether that's for animal cruelty investigations or also the fact that we're government agencies. And there has been a long history of like there's a friction between communities and government entities, especially when they have punitive measures. And this is an example of just the instances of racial profiling that and this focuses more on Ontario, but as you see, there is a huge discrepancy between white Canadians and Canadians of other races and ethnicities. And that's important because when we go into certain communities, we have to recognize that there is a level of mistrust there that has been warranted, and that it's up to us to try to build that bridge and try to make sure we can make those connections so that we can be a resource for our communities. Also, again, feeds back into, again, of the punitive measures. There is a huge race discrepancy, and I know as we've been talking about this a lot in 2020, especially with the murder of George Floyd, but there is a huge discrepancy between policing and the justice system and BIPOC individuals. And so, for example, in Canada, Black Canadians make up about 3% of the population, but account for at least 10% of inmates in federal prison. You see this as well in Indigenous people as well. And also 20% of all card incidents were focused on Black Torontons, despite Blacks making up only 8% of Toronto residences. And why this is important for animal welfare, and we'll talk about this more in terms of social justice aspect, but really understanding that when we utilize punitive measures, even punitive measures that we might feel are not as abrasive as jail time, but even like fines or creating policies that prevent access to resources due to what we feel is behavior, we're still participating in this system of unjustly punishing people that just due to either economic hardship or due to race and ethnicity. And kind of, again, another way how this shows up in animal welfare. So I think sometimes I always want to use this as an example. I think we've all seen this photo before, or maybe we've taken this photo, or maybe we've went on the internet and seen someone rescue this little puppy that they found covered in mange, and they post a picture of asking for help. And what are some of the images that generates sometimes, or some of the notes that you see? Sometimes they're usually really negative, right? Or especially negative around people, like the human race, kind of criticizing the human race, saying that how terrible people are that made this happen. And sometimes we either engage in this ourselves or we utilize this, or animal welfare has utilized this messaging for some time to invoke sympathy or to try to get attention. But what we forget is when we're doing this, not only are we feeding into some really terrible stereotypes, but what we're also doing is not actually sharing the full picture. Do we know what happened here? Was this actually neglect, or was it someone who just loved their pet and just didn't have the resources to care for them at that time? And when we actually show the whole narrative and then actually try to do what we can to break down barriers instead of trying to create villains, we were able to then keep the we were able to show that love and then keep those families intact and help more pets along the way. Before you can get into the how, I always like to make sure people recognize they have to know where they're starting. And we have to, and before we can move forward, we have to, as a movement, we have to recognize the racial and social injustice that animal welfare has directly participated in. And so this chart kind of just kind of breaks those down into a few levels. So we have the micro levels and the macro levels. And so one of the in the micro level is the part where I say that we can kind of focus within our organization with our staff and ourselves, and the macro is with like kind of larger policies of the P, like how can we work with our institutions, our community, and how can we advocate for social, like larger social scale structural change. And then the internalized part of the micro level we like to start with, because this is where you sometimes hear that language that we can start to work with changing, like those people live in bad neighborhoods. And what is a bad neighborhood? Or I have to convince certain individuals to spay neuter their pets. This kind of thought process is usually rooted in thinking in behaviors that where we think that only a certain type of person should be able to own a pet. And usually, and that's just usually because a lot of humans, and if you're not doing it on purpose, we tend to gravitate towards people who are like us. And if the individuals that we're around are a certain race or a certain social economic background, we tend to think that is the correct way. And it's important to remember to kind of step back from that when you start to hear these thoughts in your head, and really take a step back and look at the bigger picture of where might this be coming from? Are these preconceived notions that I have, and is this in the best interest of my community and for the pets that I'm serving? The intrapersonal, this is attitudes towards others. So making sure that this is kind of the area where we feel that we have to come into communities and try to change them. So communities know how to, I think there's a misconception that communities need us to come in and teach them, or you hear that term education a lot. And it really kind of boils down to that a lot of people know how to care for their pets. It's just that they don't have access to their resources. Like an individual, for example, knows that their pet might need vet care, but if there are no vets in their area, then how are they able to provide that? So they need to be resourceful and they might try something different. And it's that understanding and approaching that situation of sharing information, and that's a two-way street versus trying to come in and be a savior. And when you notice to each change that shift, you'll start to see more cooperation and trust slowly begin to build between you and your community. Institutional, this is important too, like looking at policies that affect your community, like breed-specific policies, and to also or be used to kind of target and penalize areas with a lower socioeconomic status or people of color, limiting also into like our hours for sheltering. Like for example, if you have like one low cost vaccine clinic, but it's always like on a Tuesday in the middle afternoon, even if it's free, it's not free for that person if they have to take off of work and then they're losing wages. So it's really just thinking about are the policies that we create culturally competent, and are they also respectful of the community that we serve? And structural. So really just making sure that this is where we start looking for that bigger policy enforcement. Animal welfare is a social service. And while we focus on animals, we really focus on the animals, people, and the entire connection and how we all connect into our environment. And because of that, we need to be an advocate for social issues and also stand with other social welfare programs and make sure that we're working with them in order to make a better society for all. So that means supporting programs that push for equity in housing, or equity in access to medical care, or even just equity and like environmental racism, and also trying to look at our own policies as animal welfare professionals, and see how can we make things that have been inequitable in the past, try to make that a little bit more equitable and accessible for all. Another aspect that I want to talk about is the stories that we tell. So, and this kind of goes into how we market our work that we do. We control, and for a very long time, animal welfare has controlled this narrative, and it's important to recognize the consequences of doing that, both good and bad. We know that sometimes, like for a while, there's been kind of the sympathy approach in terms of marketing for our pets. You'll show the picture of the sad little puppy, and sometimes that we need, and we sometimes we feel we need a villain for there in order to get people to rally around us. But it's important that we recognize that when we're making villains people, that we are actually complicit and directly contributing to stereotypes and myths about people and pets and who owns them. So what I always like to say to someone, if you need to make a story, make sure, and you need a villain, the villain should be poverty, or the villain should be no access to vet care, or the poverty, or the villain could be like the lack of housing. We want to make sure that it's never the individuals, because they also are part of an inequitable system, and our goal is again to try to make sure that we are making sure our services are equitable and fair and just. You want to make sure when you tell stories, especially when you're telling stories about a client, that they're told in an authentic, nuanced, and inclusive way. You want to make sure it's showing positive things only, and impacting this and celebrating the bond between that person and that pet. I think sometimes what we see in a certain pitfall in the effort to highlight some great stories of us helping people and pets stay together, we take an approach where that person loses agency in their story. So you want to make sure that, and a rule of thumb I like to say is, when I share this story, would I be comfortable sharing the story with this person right next to me? And if the answer is no, then you probably need to go back and retool. And again, focusing on the positive pieces, focusing on that bond, again, focusing on providing on how you both came together to a conclusion to find a solution for that was best for that family and that pet. You want to make sure that that agency and that positivity stays intact in all of your stories. So, and what works? You want to make sure that you're extending compassion and understanding to people. The I always say like empathy is one of the major practicing radical empathy is one of the major ways in order to move forward in this work. And empathy is really just trying to put yourself in that person's shoes and really understand where they're coming from, even if you haven't experienced that already. And that takes time and practice. I always say that it's, you want to make sure that you can try to understand their story, even if you don't necessarily agree with it, or if you can't personally relate to it. An example I like to use is, there was one time I had a person I was working with, and they were debating whether or not they wanted to crop their dog's ears. I obviously, ear cropping is something that I am not comfortable with. But I had to, but I asked why were they interested in that, and listening to their story about how everyone in their family had dogs were ear cropped and they didn't want their dog to feel left out. And I could empathize with the feeling of like peer pressure, because that part I've experienced before. And to left in the story, we had a great conversation, and I gave him resources, and he decided not to move forward with it. But the idea of like, but if my first instinct was to stop and to not try to empathize with this person, I could have easily just shut off, felt that that person was not a worthy person to speak with about providing resources, and then that person would have received no information and would have had to make decisions based off of their best judgment, which is not what our job is. You want to make sure you become informed on issues of racial and economic inequity. This is really key for your community as well. Learn the makeup of your community. Engage with individuals on that level, and really try to learn like culturally what's valuable to them. Understand what are the situations that are happening in your neighborhood around racial and economic inequity. Learn who are the major leaders in that movement as well. Every community has community leaders and community organizers and people that they really trust. And as you start to navigate that and learn that, you'll be able to fully serve your community in a way that is best for them. And you want to start, when you do that work, you want to start identifying and removing barriers to service and engagement. And again, this is important to do with your community. Sometimes we feel that there might be a certain barrier, but we have to remember that we're thinking in a lens that is an animal welfare professional with access to information. And that is completely different than what your community might need or might feel that they might need. So make sure that while you're removing those barriers, and some you have to remove without community input if there's like laws around, but any that you can, you want to make sure you're actively engaging in the communities that those barriers affect. And you want to make sure that you're connecting with others in movements that are creating equity and access, like I said, really interacting with not only just community members, but other human-based organizations. Sometimes the best collaboration in animal welfare and helping people and pets is actually connecting people to human resources. So that might be working with the domestic violence center in your area, or working with Department of Homeless Services if you have one, or working with or working with just like your human health agencies as a whole. Really working with everyone, and then both of you working with a referral system, because not only does that help the clients that come to you, then if those individuals run across people who are going through a crisis and they have pets, they know who to call as well. And then we can create a wider safety net in order to help as more people and pets. And you have to commit to the hard and long-term work. This will not happen overnight. And I think the important part and I always tell everyone who's starting to do this work, is that it's going to be very uncomfortable at the beginning. And it's going to not feel so great. The first step is that if there has been tons of mistrust in the past between you and your communities, that doesn't go away overnight. That's going to be a slow, probably over a few years of building that trust again. And also part of building that trust is having difficult conversations and having to reconcile with what we might have done in the past and how we want to move forward. And it's okay to be uncomfortable in those situations. We're all human, but the important thing is to not let that deter you and not let that shut you down, but to go through those conversations together and make sure that that both sides can learn from each other and have a meaningful dialogue and move forward from it and make a great plan. So some policies and enforcement form to look through. Commonly, these are some of the few policies that we see where organizations can start this work. The one easier one, because, well, it depends on where you are and your rules, but return to owners. Return to owners, and it varies from county to county and country to country and state to state. But there's usually a few barriers that are in place when someone has to reclaim their pet back from a sheltering system. That could be spay neuter rules, that could be license fees, that can be compounded fees for everyday animals boarding. And when we have those barriers, we're really just basically punishing someone for not having access to resources in a timely manner, which is punishing poverty. And which again feels more distrust between the community and your agency. So whenever possible, try to find the ways that you can navigate those. Can you waive RTO fees? Can you work with someone if someone needs to spay neuter surgery and they're not willing to do it? Can you talk to them and build that trust over time? If there are laws around that, then that's, you have to work within those laws, but can your organization navigate and advocate with your community leaders to review these laws and see, are they punishing a certain population of people unfairly? There's one way that you can do right now. Sometimes you can work with donors to build a kind of a fund to help offset or subsidize some of those costs. There are incremental ways that you can kind of tackle this to make return to owners more equitable and to let pets go back home with their families that care about them. Adoptions as well. Take a strong look at your adoption policy. Are you adopting to everyone in your community? Or is everyone who comes in treated the same, regardless of their race, ethnicity, the way that they look, or the way that they're even acting that day? Is someone really frustrated and that is enough of a reason for someone to not move forward with adoption? Are you looking to try to make matches, or are we looking for reasons to deny? That's an important thing to review as well. Are we also changing our adoption fees based off of the desirability of animals? Like, for example, are we having small, fluffy, cute adoption fees higher than some of our pity friends, and kind of limiting who gets to adopt the small, fluffy, cutes and our pity friends, and making sure, and what does that mean when we do that? And what does it say about who we value, both animals and the people who adopt? Just things to think about as you go through this when you look through your work. Owner-present euthanasia is a huge one. Do you offer it? Can clients come to you to euthanize their pets if that is their best choice? When you do offer it, are they allowed to be there with their pets in their final time? And is there, again, scale, or is there ways to make that accessible if they don't have access to funds? And if so, do they have autonomy over their animals' remains? There's a lot of ways that we need to look through our euthanasia policies to make sure that it is being equitable for all. And with owner surrenders, are we providing resources? Are we providing them equitably to all people, or just to people that we feel deserve to keep their pet versus they might be surrendering for a reason that we don't think that they should keep their animal? And what does that look like? Is it a list of resources, or is it an in-depth conversation that is unique to that person? And and then rethinking cruelty and neglect. We're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail later, but I want to just start with this piece. Sometimes it goes back into the punishment to support model. Sometimes we want to make sure, are we, what we're actually prosecuting as cruelty, is it actually cruelty, and is using a punitive measure the best outcome for that person and that pet? Is that animal skinny because that person's not feeding them, or have we asked for questions and maybe that animal has a parasite that we could treat, and then that person can and that pet can finally feel better, and then that family can keep their animal? Is it like, is there actually, like, do we have documented evidence that, that person didn't try to seek medical care, even if it wasn't through a traditional veterinarian? Were they trying other treatments? And is there a way that we can help them versus prosecute them? And that goes with our idea of moving to supporting. Punishment has been used historically time and time again to criminalize poverty. And if our goal in animal welfare is that we want to have healthier animals in our communities and happier animals in our communities, then it is to our best, because punishment doesn't prevent that from happening. The animal's already suffered, and it's on the it's the aftermath. If we are actually going into communities and supporting them, we're able to prevent more suffering, and to, again, kind of make sure that our organization is doing this in a socially justice mindset. So things to think about as you go through your own policies. And other considerations, again, just when you are looking at your policies, or if you're looking at your anything that you're doing in your organization, think, is this policy in place to actually help animals and promote animal welfare, or is it just penalizing poverty or people with lack of access to resources? Are my policies and are my procedures and is my organization maintaining and perpetuating systems of oppression and discrimination with these policies? Or am I actually doing things to dismantle that and to change that and make access to resources? Again, right now, animal welfare, I think we're starting to move we're starting to recognize we're starting to move in the direction of other social justice movements, but we are still pretty far behind, and we have a way to pick a way to go. And I'm really hopeful, because I think I see every day, the more I do these presentations, the more individual I talk to, I think we're in that direction. But we need to recognize and need to work with other social justice movements to kind of get to their level and try to understand about moving towards more restorative justice measures and moving for support to punishment, and really trying to increase the empathy in our field, so that way we can make a better world for people and the pets that we serve. And thank you very much for listening to me today. I'm going to open this up right now for questions. I'm a firm believer in, this is the way that we learn, is by having these dialogues. So please feel free to ask me any question that you'd like. And thank you again for having me speak. And I hope that you take these ideas and spread them throughout your communities, and we can make a more equitable place for people and pets.
Thank you so much, Aleah. So I really appreciate this information and these reminders, and of ways that we may be doing our job in an effort to protect animals, and how if we're in that single lens, how we are not only are we not fully and sustainably helping the animal, we could potentially be discriminating against the people that love them the most. And so these seminars very helpful for that, and some really great suggestions on even some little things that I think as organizations we can begin to look at our own internal policies, and then larger things that we want to maybe take on in terms of changing some policies and laws that may help to reduce the barriers that some pet guardians may experience. So we'll open it up for questions. You can either put it in the chat box if you like, or please feel free to unmute yourself and ask Aleah a question. Anyone has any questions?
You can place it in the chat box as well if you prefer chatting versus talking.
Kevin, I see that you've raised a hand. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious about, so I work in the downtown east side in Vancouver, and we have several tent cities, and a few of my clients have lost their pet when they were
I
doing cleanup.
apologize, Kevin. I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing you.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I work in the downtown east side in Vancouver, and several of our clients lost a few pets when they were clearing out the tent cities. And so, how do they go about recovering pets when they don't have any proof that they actually own the pet?
That's a really great question. So I think that's a few things. So one is that would have to look at your internal, like your Vancouver's policies around that. So I can use my previous experience. So for 6 years, I worked for Animal Care Centers of New York City. So that's the large municipal sheltering system for New York City. So high volume, lots of animals coming in, over about 30,000 animals a year coming in through the door. And my team focused on intake and intake and surrender prevention. So we would have clients, especially some that are experiencing homelessness or some that lost their homes, who were trying to reclaim their pets. And that's where where you have to work with other human-based social systems. So if someone comes, and it's about trying to be a little bit more solution-oriented and trying to work with the systems that are there. So one thing that was really helpful, and I did that work, and I know every community is different, but knowing some social workers is really key. And there's a lot of social workers that love pets, and they really understand the human animal bond and want to work with organizations to keep that intact. So if you know of any in your area, especially some that work with your Department of Human Services or Health Services or whichever, or any human agencies, they can sometimes direct them, and you can work with them and try to find a temporary solution for that pet. That is something that a program you would, as you start to look through your systems, you want to look as a whole, because you would have to do some organizing with for example, like housing the pets for so long. How are you going to make sure you can subsidize or waive any fees? But yeah, it's really good. Animal welfare can't do it all. Like, we are one entity of a giant social, of a human, like of a giant like social system. So the more we can interact with others, the better we can do. And for proof of that pet, sometimes it's, I have seen cases where I'm like, do you have any photos in your phone if you don't have of your pet? So we can use that as proof. Do you have, did you post a picture of them on Facebook at all? Sometimes what we did is like, do you have 2 notarized letters? We've tried a lot of variety of ways. Photos tend to be the easiest if someone doesn't have actual physical vet documents or things like that. And yeah, and sometimes you have to kind of have those moments where you and your organization debates what is in the best interest of that pet and that person at that moment, and decide like how is this can we figure, like, we want to make sure that we are assuming the best in people, but we also understand that we have illegal liabilities. So we need to just kind of work within our system to see what can we come up with that can be the best for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I see that in the comment, Kevin's, and I think Kevin is from Human Services. Actually, I think he works in is an outreach worker. And I see that he said he's started to take pictures with pets, and any markings that the pets have as actual proof. And I think that's a good way to start too. And I think there's a lot of work to be done with municipal governments in how we can work together to support the animals that come through their shelters. Amelia has a question. Can you share more about ideas for successful fundraising narratives telling positive stories? I love the measures you've shared about not telling a story unless you tell it the same way with the person right beside you. But often it feels like people are hesitant to shift from the tried and true narratives we've historically used because they're uncomfortable or worried or just don't know how.
Yes. So one thing I will say is I'll put it in the chat shortly before we leave, but if you go to humanepro.org, we have what's called our Pets for Life Sustainability Guide, which is a great resource for individuals who are starting to do this work. And we discuss like how to navigate those conversations and how you can make a successful fundraising campaign that is still equitable and ethical. So please take a look at that. But I think the key thing with that is you have to be a little brave, because you will make a mistake. It's going to happen. And the idea is like and the idea is that, okay, you learn from that and move forward. And so one way that I always like to say is, first, if you are going out into the community and asking the person to do the story, so if you want to first try it, do interviews. I think that's one of the easier ways to have a story where you don't have to worry about the person's voice because they're actively talking. So one campaign I saw that I worked with an organization that I loved is that they had a vaccine clinic, and they just went around and interviewed people, like kind of like red carpet style, and was like, tell me about why you love your pet. And the stories that were just told were so great. Like, we've heard a wide variety of like that my pet's my best friend, to like, I was going through a really difficult time, and this pet was what saved me. And you can really just hear that highlight of the animal bond through that person's voice. That's one one way I'd like the people start that if they're really hesitant about crafting stories, and worried about how that's going to come off. And like I said, and that guide is really helpful. But the key is just making sure that you are going into those communities, talking to people. Like, you physically have to go into the communities and physically talk to people. And then after a while, when you hear that story and you're getting their information, it will come off as authentic and true because you actively did the work. And again, not being afraid that you will make a mistake. And if someone corrects you in this mistake, having the humility to accept that and move forward and learning from it, because that's like, we're all human and we're all trying our best. But the key is making sure that we learn from those mistakes and we don't become defensive, because that's when the communication starts to break down. And to be glad when your community calls you out on mistakes, because that means that they trust you enough to know that you can do better. Well, if you don't hear people calling you out on mistakes, that probably means that that doesn't necessarily mean you're not making them. It could just mean that there's that level that they don't feel confident or comfortable that their voice will make actual change. So those are just things to keep in mind.
And Aleah, do you think that part of the work is actually advocacy to our donors and supporters? Like, if we're shifting the work that we're doing, to say, to explain to them why this is important, right? So it's as much as we're educating ourselves internally, we have to also recognize that folks who may have been, and not so much, folks who've been supporting certain rescue organizations are doing so for a certain reason. And so if we're starting to shift, then through our stories, they're also a really great opportunity for advocacy.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think yes, I think that's true. But I think it's also important too that as we shift our stories, I've seen a few things as I've seen organizations shift stories. One, I've seen some donors who actually appreciate that shift because they're learning with you, and that's always key. And or what you'll see is, while you might, and it's important to recognize because it's the truth, you might lose some donors because some may not be willing to move to this story, but in the ones that you lose, you'll also gain new ones. And I think that is what's really key here, is that there's so many people who love animals, but they felt so excluded from this world. And so they didn't feel like they had a place in it or a voice in it. And as we start to open those doors, you will see more people coming in who are like, yes, this is the human animal bond. This is the part I want it to focus on. This is the part that I want to contribute and help with. And you'll start to see more donors. An example I like to use is, a few years ago, during one of the Day of Givings, they HSUS decided to highlight the Pets for Life program. And we were very adamant about this way that we wanted to do our storytelling. We wanted to make sure it was done equitably, like focusing on the human animal bond, not focusing on helping, not focusing on negatives, but really focusing on the positive. And it was one of the most successful campaigns in actually getting new donors. We actually saw a 30% increase of first-time donors to our program. And that is what I like to let people know, is like, yes, like, while you definitely will want to try to provide the information to your donors, some will come on board, some are not going to, and that's okay. because you will also get new donors that follow your mission. And I am a firm believer in that if you want to be a humane and equitable organization, everyone from the top all the way to the bottom has to kind of embody that same mindset, because it won't come off as authentic through your programs if they don't. So
yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? No. Okay, well, I will say thank you to Aleah. We are recording this, and so I will email it out to everyone that has registered once we've uploaded it. And yeah, thank you so much, Aleah, for your really informative presentation, and for the work that Pets for Life is doing across United States and Canada. It's really great, and a lot for us to be able to take in. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out or contact me. And like I said, please check out I'll actually type in right now, it's humanepro.org. And if you go to Pets for Life, we have a lot of resources on there as well. Our sustainability guide is great when trying to navigate how to create these stories. And also some great information too about how to talk to your to your staff and to your donors and to everyone about creating more equitable space in animal welfare. So
super, that's great. So that's in the chat box if you haven't seen it, humanepro.org. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.
All right, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.